calling to us all. I will pour out my spirit. I will pour out my power. Share my dreaming, shower you with visions. I will pour out my power. Pour out justice overflowing. Pour out mercy for this hour. Pour compassion on your people. Let your spirit flow with power. Love is moving through this body. Love is moving in this place, breathing through us, helping us grow stronger. Love is moving through this place. Pour out justice, pour out justice, overflowing. Pour out mercy for this hour. Pour compassion on your people. Let your spirit flow with power. Pour out justice overflowing. Pour out mercy for this hour. Pour compassion on your people. Let your spirit flow with power. Let your spirit flow with power.
Good evening. I'm Reverend Dr. Velda Love, United Church of Christ Minister of Racial Justice. And on behalf of the United Church of Christ, General Minister and President, Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer, and our esteemed Associate General Ministers, Reverend Tracy Blackman and Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, I bring you greetings and Lenten blessings. We are here this evening first to acknowledge two important days recognized by the United Nations, the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, which began in 2014 and runs through 2025. However, the work to acknowledge and honor our ancestors, as well as eliminate xenophobia and anti-Black racism, is a work that is 365 days a year and every day of our lives for us and for you and for the Christian church. The 2 days that are marked that we are discussing this evening are the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racism and the UN International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. People of African descent gather globally to not only acknowledge dates on the UN calendar, but those of us who are of a global community, the African diaspora, remember and honor our ancestors. For over 400 years, more than 15 million men, women, and children were the victims of the tragic transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. In commemoration of the memory of the victims, the General Assembly, in its resolution 62-122 on December 17, 2007, declared March 25th the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade to be observed annually. The annual observance offers the opportunity to honor, remember, and to keep in our hearts those who are still descendants around the globe. We remember those who suffered and died at the hands of the brutal system of enslaving people of African descent. The International Day also aims at raising awareness about the ongoing dangers of racism and prejudice in our nation and globally. This evening, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists, daughters of the diaspora, womanist thought leaders, theologians and professors, Hebrew Bible scholars and pastors. They are sisters, friends, daughters, mothers, aunties, colleagues, and mentors. But most of all, they are sacred and they are family. They will be leading us in conversation and speaking with us through their lived experiences. Tonight, we will focus on lessons from the Hebrew Bible, the enduring resilience of African descended women. And our focus this evening is on the book of Job. This evening, we shall not only listen and learn, but we will be leaning into how to continue working towards dismantling racism in our world by remembering the enslaved, trafficked, and sold into slavery for over 250 years. But we will also renew our passion for sacred text as radical resistance, liberation, and justice in the 21st century. And so I'd like to introduce to you, my friends and my sisters and sacred family. Valerie Bridgman is Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Homiletics and Hebrew Bible at Methodist Theological Seminary in Ohio, in Delaware, Ohio. Vanessa Lovelace is Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the Seminary and Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And Stephanie Crumpton, Associate Professor of Practical Theology from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. These are our panelists, and these are the voices that will be engaging us this evening. And so, ladies, welcome. It is good to see you. I want to begin this evening with just an opening for our participants to have a glimpse of who you are, and you can go one at a time in any order that you choose. But often when we begin to think about remembering our ancestors, it is what they gave us, what's in our DNA, and what they have left us, even in spite of the horror of the transatlantic slave trade. And so I would like for you to first self-identify, and that's an intersectional identification, because it's all inclusive. It's everything that you are when you show up in the world. Tell us who you are. Dr. Bridgman.
I thought you said you were going to go in any order. I was waiting on Vanessa to go. Can I pass the baton? Okay. I'm Valerie Bridgman. I am the daughter of Bernice O'Neill McKinney Bridgman, who was the daughter of Callie Pearson McKinney, who was the daughter of Lizzie White, who came up out of slavery when she was 12 years old. I am the daughter of the Deep South. I grew up in Central Alabama in the shadow of Bull Connor's Birmingham, as we used to call Birmingham. I'm a poet. I used to be a clarinet player. It's still sitting by my bed. So I hold great hopes that I'll return to the clarinet. I'm a hiker, a scholar, a mother, a grandmother, the grandmother of 3, which I'm really proud of, being a grandmother. And a daughter of the church. I grew up in a small rural Baptist church, and my dad became a Church of God Anderson preacher, and I see myself as related to the church at large. So I see myself as a daughter of the church and a doctor of the church. I hope to help heal the church writ large of all of her ills, all of them. So I'll leave it at that for an introduction, and you can ask me anything you want to about any of that I said, if that wasn't sufficient.
Thank you, Valerie. Vanessa.
Oh, wait a minute. I should have said, and I'm a cat owner, because, Zuri.
Thank you. We can't see Zuri, but we honor Zuri as well. So Dr. Vanessa Lovelace.
Good evening. As has already been said, I'm Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. I would begin by saying I'm the daughter of Ralph and Barbara Lovelace, but growing up, I identified as Little Ralph, because not only was I my father's shadow, and I went everywhere with him and everyone started calling me that, but my father raised me, as I like to describe, as a firstborn son. And by that, he raised me with a sense of that I could do anything, that there wasn't anything that, any barriers in my way, that there wasn't anything that I could not accomplish because I was a girl. And I really appreciate that about my father. And I would say, as I got older, I definitely identify as Barbara's daughter. I look like my mother more now. I definitely sound like her. I have her mannerisms, which I know come from her mother, Lula Matkins, and from her mother and from her mother. And so it is really interesting how those things do get passed down through generations. Mannerisms, way of speaking, expressions that we use. And so I definitely am Ralph and Barbara's daughter. I am also the spouse of Wilford Bentley. We have 3 children, so I'm a mother and we have a granddaughter. I'm a scholar. I am, even before they use the term, unashamedly Black and unapologetically Christian, and all that means to me. A womanist, and we'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. And Dr. Stephanie Crumpton.
Good evening, everyone. I am Stephanie Marie Crumpton. I am the daughter of Janice McCullough and Wayne Philip Crumpton. Wayne Philip Crumpton is the son, one of 7 siblings, of Margaret Marie Crumpton and Isaiah Crumpton. I always now make it a point to say my middle name because it was not until I was eulogizing my grandmother that I found out that we shared the same middle name. So I always try to make sure that I mention her middle name as also as mine. On my mother's side, my mother's parents are Arthur McCullough and Helen McCullough. Both sides of my family came from the west side of Chicago. So I also say that I'm a child of the 4100 block of West End on 4210 on West End in Chicago. I am a child of that block because I very much remember that as being the early beginnings of my awareness of what was happening in Chicago socially and politically. I was a little girl. You know, my early childhood was spent there on the west side, and I was a neighborhood or a block child. Everybody looked out for me on the block, including when I was doing things or in places where I should not be, as well as when I was hungry, somebody would give me a snack. And so I always mention the 4200 block of West End, and I also mention my grandparents, who between all 4 of them taught me how to sew, taught me how to cook, taught me how to garden, taught me how to till a yard, taught me how to plant, taught me that if I could draw it, then they would make sure I had what I needed to make it. And that probably is a key part of how I moved through the world in my scholarship as a womanist pastoral theologian. It was a gift between people who tilled the land, tended the kitchen, and also manned the sewing machine. Because my grandfather used to make upholstery things and my grandmother taught me how to sew clothes. There was no limit to what I could create so long as I had what I needed. And they saw to it that I had what I needed to make an idea come true. And that is very much how I approach my scholarship and also my practice and healing work in communities. That healing work looks like me as a yoga instructor, which has been wonderful. I enjoy it. It is demanding, and there's so much more to it than bending your body in some strange ways. It's become a way for me to meet myself and help others meet themselves and reclaim themselves in safe and empowering ways. So I think that's a good place. Oh, wait, Dr. Valerie, I too am a pet. Well, I'm a pet parent. You have like biological children. I have a dog child, and his name is Freedom. And yeah, so I think that's a good place to start and stop for the moment.
Thank you. As we honor this evening based on the UN decade, I want us to think about the ways in which, as people of African descent, our history was interrupted. Everything that you named is part of our identities because our ancestors did them. They took care of the land, they raised animals, they made their food and their clothing. And then we have this saying, we made a way out of no way. And here we are in this moment. And so just share a little bit about what your life experiences have you contributed to being deeply engaged and invested in the lives of African descendant people. Why is that investment important to you in this moment? And what does that mean for us in this moment, given what we have been through for the last 500 years? All right, I see I'm gonna have to call on someone. Stephanie.
I had my face turned to the ceiling looking for an answer. So I guess it's time to bring that answer down. So I think that my immediate work is around the healing of African American persons, right? And so there are ways in which we think about healing primarily as recovery work or patching up a wound or attending to a pain. But I'm also in some conversations and some deep thinking that have to do with healing work is also about reclamation of joy, around reclamation of the little kernels that had to get put away for safety and survival's sake, of love, of fun, right? Of creativity. Um, there are ways in which this conversation, the conversations around Black healing, interestingly enough, Black healing from white supremacy, interestingly enough, those conversations can still center white supremacy and whiteness, right? If the majority of the conversation is around, and it's necessary to name what hurts us, right? So I don't want to skip over that. But the harder work, or I should say the parallel work, needs to be, what is it that we're going back to get, right? If we mean transgenerationally and we're talking about the stories of our elders and our ancestors, we aren't just going back, right, to identify who was lost and what happened and the traumatic event. That is important. And thank God for the monuments and the museums that are doing that important work. But I also want for us to think about, how can we go back and retrieve the passion, the creativity, right? What were the things that we were in process of dreaming about before we had to take up arms to defend ourselves? So we do need to do the work of what interrupted the dreaming, but the essential life-giving work, the thriving work, right? The seeds of what it is to thrive are found in recovering what was the dream. What was the joy? What was this out of this world notion? As a matter of fact, within this context, what was the holy desire for what life could look like that got interrupted, right? When we had to snatch up, when babies were being taken from us, families were being broken apart, or even, and so we think about that in terms of actual enslavement, but even in the generations after that, Jim and Jane Crow, right? And what was taken from, what was the dream about what the land could have been before we had to essentially lease it back to ourselves during sharecropping, right? What was the dream? What was the joy? What was the fantasy? What are those things? And to then bring that forward and to recognize that not only are persons of African descent carriers of a deep transgenerational wound and pain from racism and all of its cousins. That's what I call the various other oppressions, its cousins. But we're also the carriers of what somebody couldn't even imagine would happen and what somebody knew one day had to happen, right? And so I think it's important, my work around healing, the reason why I'm committed to it is because I know that there is more to us than our hurt. And being consistently focused, oftentimes for reasons of safety and sanity, on the impact of white racism, right, can still in some ways distract us from the project of creation. And so I'm wanting us, I'm interested in the creativity of Black people. I'm interested in the generativity of Black community and Black collectives. And so those are the reasons why I come to this work. And it's also what gives me joy, right? It gives me like deep and profound joy when I walk with someone and we help each other remember, right? And so those are some of the things that bring me to this work and encourage me to stay in it and to support others.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Creativity, joy, and what are our dreams? Vanessa.
See, I tried to get in there first. I had unmuted myself, so I would not have to follow someone who is the theologian, the clinical pastoral care person who's working on this stuff as part of her day-to-day work in terms of trauma and resilience for Black people. I think why I do this work, I think that was the question, is for one, as I said earlier, as someone, unashamedly Black, I live into my Blackness. I love being Black. I just think there is such a beauty in it, despite the pain and the trauma globally. We speak in terms of, as US, racism and anti-Blackness, but on one level, Black people, no matter where they go on the globe, there was a young Tanzanian student was attacked in India, driving with some friends because they mistook her for someone else. And you have Blacks in Moscow being attacked. The Black life in Brazil, the most vulnerable people are in Brazil and South America are Black people. So no matter where we are, and we are everywhere in the globe, we have to deal with anti-Black discrimination, racism, violence. And so on the one hand, it's global, but it's also experienced differently from across the globe as it is here, because we've really perfected that apartheid and that anti-Black violence and racism here, and then imported it globally, which is partly why the violence is so global in its impact of Black people, no matter where they are. Because we know that African descended people are Igbo and Yoruba and the Fulani, they're not Black until they get here. It is not until they come to the US that they are racialized as Black, and that is seen as negative, and that is seen as something to, as a threat, as something to attack, as something that's an affront to white people, to white supremacy and power, that then needs to push down to respond to it when Black people try and assert their dignity and humanity. And so it certainly looks different globally, but we still, I think, and part of, when Dr. Crumpton's talking about some of the trauma that we continue to carry in our genes, we also carry that joy, that resilience, that love of life, that spirit that I think has kept us through all of that trauma that we've been carrying. I would say I should not be here because of the racism that Black women in particular, but Blacks in general, have experienced. When I talked about Lula Matkins, my mother's mother, she died from chronic liver disease, from alcohol poison. My paternal grandmother, Virginia Ryan Lovelace, died from not getting the medical attention for colon cancer. So, but those are the impacts of being Black and being Black women in America. And that's why I said I shouldn't be here. I don't know how my mother and her sister managed to survive that and to thrive and to be able to instill in me the strength and the resilience that I have today as a Black woman. And so what keeps me going is, or why this work is important for me, one is to help educate, because even despite what we live into as Black people and the violence that we experience, you still have a number of Black people who, until George Floyd, would say, I never experienced it, I don't really understand it. A lot of us had a rude awakening with seeing the images of George Floyd being killed by the police officer in Minneapolis. And so trying to bring an awareness of saying, well, this is what racism and white supremacy looks like on a day-to-day basis that you didn't realize because of those microaggressions. And then to get beyond education and awareness, but then, okay, so how do we have the tools to survive, to be encouraged, to continue to be encouraged and not lose faith. And but then, so then how do we thrive? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our children? And how do we give them the tools to do better than what we've experienced for each generation? Because on the one hand, as we see, the more things change, the more they stay the same. With every effort that we make to be dignified, to retain our humanity, and we have made progress, but with each effort, the empire, as I said, the empire strikes back. The resistance to that movement always comes out and rises up with even more animus and hatred. And so, you know, having to deal, how do we break the cycle? And my work is to try and break that cycle of having to do this work over and over and over again. The Voting Rights Act, you know, having to, every time we get ahead with voting, then there's a new resistance. And it's all legal. That's the really hard part. You know, the US Supreme Court will back those efforts and say that those are legal, and that there is no race, that they're race neutral efforts to stop Black and other people of color and poor white people from voting to gain power, because that is one of the ways that we still can gain power in the US. So I will stop there and let Dr. Bridgman get in here, but like I said, I tried to get in there before Dr. Crumpton.
Thank you, Vanessa. Dr. Bridgman, what brings you to this work?
Yeah, so what brings me to this work is my ancestors. So when I was in Brazil, I think it was 20, I can't even remember when it was now, with the Society for the Study of Black Religion. And I got to meet this incredible priestess of Candomblé who talked about the medicine that was in the earth and that we were paving over it. And she was an activist, and she was a decolonialist and all of that. And while I was there, my grandmother, my mother's mother, Callie Pearson McKinney, visited me in my dreams. And I've always been a dreamer. And so that wasn't actually particularly surprising, but it was a powerful visitation. And I came back from that realizing that my focus was askewed, and that whatever work I do for justice had to be on behalf of my ancestors, not for anybody else. That what I do on behalf of my ancestors, I am also doing on behalf of my grandchildren. So my grandmother was a root worker. I grew up in Central Alabama. So she didn't pass that on, but she began to pass that on to me in my dreams. So I've always been able to interpret dreams. I've always been able to do some healing based on herbs and other kinds of things, and a seer. And so when I was in Brazil, it was the reclamation of that gift that passed through me from my ancestors. So I don't do this because I think one day white people are going to wake up and see the light. I actually don't have that as a hope. I don't think about them to do that, honestly, when I'm doing this work. I used to. It used to, you know, just haunt me. Oh my God, how are we going to get white people to do blah, 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 blah. And now I do it for my ancestors who see something from beyond that I can't see. And so if I yield to that in my prayer time, in my meditation time, I get to see it too. And you know, to quote the old saints, so I can run on and see what the end's gonna be, right? So that's the answer.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad you brought up interpretations, because you all do womanist work. And that is part of that biblical theological work that often has to be explained. Who are womanists? What do they do? Why is it important? And is it a side thing? Because theology is seen as generally coming out of white tradition. But I always say there are theologies, And there are Christologies because we believe differently in our bodies and the way we have been socialized. So I want to move us to this conversation about why do womanists and those interpretations inform our spiritual, biblical, and theological ways of being. What is a womanist, and why is that important for our biblical, theological ways of being? And I'm going to start with, yep, Dr. Bridgman.
But why? Dr. Lovelace keeps telling you she wants to go first, and you just refuse. Okay. Wow. So there's a lot packed into that. I want to start by saying this and get my snark out. You know, every time somebody says Black women made it up, I said, so did Bart. He made that up too. Like, all the scholars make it up. You just think that when they make it up, somehow because they made it up, it has some authority to it. But we make it up out of our resources, out of our lives, out of the substance of our being, out of the substance of what we know to be true, right? So a womanist is a Black woman, a woman of color, who takes liberation of Black women at the center, believing that when Black women's lives are free, everybody else is free, because we believe in the love of the whole folk. And a lot of times people I've heard people say things like, oh, womanists only care about women. I'm like, you really are not paying attention on purpose. And I know you're not. You're trying to distort what we're saying. Stop it. That's, I'm trying my best not to cuss because we're on a Zoom here, and I'm gonna do my best not to cuss, but I am a cussing prophet. So if it slips out at some point, y'all just have to deal with it. But so there's that. The other piece here is what I know for sure is not all Black women are womanists. Just because you're a Black woman does not make you a womanist. You have to commit yourself to the liberation of the folk. And you have to commit yourself to a healing principle. And not every Black woman does that. I know that. I know Black women scholars who are offended if you call them a womanist. And because they want to hold on to white patriarchal interpretive skills. I have no need for that. I believe that what I bring to the biblical text and what I bring to theology is just as important, or sometimes more so, because it has been in the fiery furnace. It has been born out of grief, and those kinds of theologies usually have more umph to them than theologies of comfort. When every time I hear one of my students say something like, well, I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, I say, comfort is not a spiritual discipline. So so what are you talking about? We know how to, I love this quote, and I say it often, from Alice Walker: hard times require furious dancing. We know how to dance in the hard times. This is a part of the womanist thing. We love roundness. We love food. We love laughter. We believe that the first person that walked to Canada wasn't the last one. So freedom is a part of the work of a womanist scholar. That's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. So I want to just point to some of the resources that give me life, because all of you have contributed to them. And I'm waiting for Stephanie's book. It is coming. But I want to raise womanist interpretations of the Bible and expanding the discourse. And this is Gay L. Byron and Vanessa Lovelace, with a compilation of other womanist scholars. And Dr. Valerie Bridgman is in this edition. as well as the Africana Bible. So the Africana Bible, Reading Israel Scriptures from Africa and the African Diaspora. Dr. Bridgman is in this one as well. And the People's Companion to the Bible is also a resource that is used in the work that I do. And so these resources fuel the imagination because they come out of the context, the very fabric, the very flesh of who we are. So Vanessa, you have more of the, you have the first generation, you got the coming generation, you have generations of women speaking. What is a womanist interpretation?
A womanist interpretation certainly begins with, in this case, I would say engaging the scriptures. I don't want us, because one of the things about womanists is that although scripture in the traditionally, especially in the African American Protestant church, is authoritative, it is not the ultimate source, beginning with women's experience, Black women and other women of color's experience. And I include other women of color because not only did Alice Walker use that or identify other women of color in her 4-part poetic definition in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose, but other women in the diaspora have appropriated when they first saw it, just as we did in the early 80s, said, finally something that resonates with my soul, that another name that I can identify with, that feminist just didn't fit. It was more organic, more natural to the folk, especially when she talks about coming out of womanish. Those, I think what's so different about womanist is when I said about my mother, that I have her expressions, that I walk and do things the way she did, that I've carried those in my DNA, that's what really makes womanism unique, that it comes out of that sense of inherited, just of being part of a specific culture. Whether that's an Africana culture, whether that's a South Asian culture of women and their daughters together. It just comes out of that naturalness of women being and learning together, teaching young girls how to be women, how to express themselves, and what are those boundaries. And so I think talking about coming out of our own experiences, those when Dr. Bridgman talked about the roots and those things that are passed down, for me, womanism is all of that. And so as one approaches the biblical text, bringing those experiences, bringing those traditions, bringing that past and bringing that spirituality to reading the text. It doesn't require someone to be an expert in the biblical languages to approach the text to do that, because we know that 19th century women who interpreted the Bible to affirm their right to both anti-slavery, to the abolitionist movement, and to anti-sexism, and the early movement for women's rights, that they used the Bible to justify their actions, because they said, God raised up Deborah, and God raised up these other women prophets, and God raised up these other women leaders. And so certainly I can interpret the Bible to defend and affirm that I am called by God to read the Bible and do what I believe I've been called to do for God's people. And so I would say at the simplest level, it is bringing one's true self, their embodied self, through their tradition, their experiences, and the biblical authority to reading the biblical text.
Thank you. Dr. Stephanie.
Yeah, so I think for me, womanist biblical and theological interpretation is important because it helps us stop reading against ourselves. It helps us stop erasing ourselves and silencing ourselves. Womanist for me, when I first ran into, and I mean ran into because I was trying to run away from it, right? Because I didn't want to be that serious in seminary. I didn't want to be one of those too serious womanist, feminists, I didn't want to be all that. And I was running away from it. And then I realized, why are you running? Because these women and the male allies are going to help you see what you've been taught not to see in the biblical text. Right. And so in this commitment around liberation that Dr. Valerie just named, and the commitment around authority, womanist interpreters of the Bible as theological discipline partners for me taught me how to look for the voice that is being spoken for, right? They pointed out, because let's think about how many unnamed women, right? She ain't got no name, but what happened to her name? She was important enough to mention because she carried someone's child, but she didn't have a name, right? And so thinking about that kind of logic, they introduced me to the kind of logic that says, stop not seeing people who are right there, particularly the women who are right there. And also to ask the question, what happens when someone else tells someone else's story, right? And so the narrator, more often than not in the biblical text, not always, but more often than not, womanist theological and biblical interpreters taught me how to say, who is this person that is speaking for an unnamed woman, and what are their interests? And do those interests serve the humanity, the full humanity of the woman they're talking about? Which further then helped me ask the question to ask, this woman, does she have a humanity in that culture other than to serve the interests of everybody else when fewer are interested in her humanity, right? And so these are questions that I learned to ask of the narratives, which then made me then pull those questions out and look around and start to ask the same question of women's lives, women's and girls' lives and experiences. Who is speaking for whom? Right? And in that process of speaking for someone, what story is not being told? Who does the story privilege? What's being erased? What would happen if so-and-so was first off, had a name, and second of all, had space to speak? What is the tenor and sound of her voice as she speaks? And the power of that for girls and women and boys and men and old people. What is the power of hearing the silenced voice? There are opportunities for resonance, deep resonance, when you can hear someone speaking from the same occupied position that you may be experiencing. There's power in that. And womanist biblical interpreters taught me how to do that, right? And so I think that is an important reading strategy as we actually take up sacred text. And then they also taught me that just because it's in there doesn't mean it's a good idea. Yeah. And who is it a good idea for? Right? And they taught me the importance of reading. Am I reading this descriptively as it's describing something, or am I always reading this prescriptively? And when I read it prescriptively and it reads against my humanity as a female person, what do I do with that? And so the womanist that I have been reading since seminary and beyond, and who I'm grateful to call mentors and friends and colleagues, continue to help me to ask those kinds of questions, right? So that I'm clear about the process of helping others come to voice, right? The process of making visible what has always been there right in front of us. But because we've been taught to look somewhere else, to not identify those undervalued and unnamed voices or unamplified voices as valueless, what does it mean when you shift that table? And womanists have taught me how to get into position and use my scholarship, right? To open up doors, to secure a place in the literature in our field, that these women's stories are there. And they are speaking for themselves. And also a particular piece around womanist methodology centers the voices and lived experience of African-American girls and women, and by extension, other persons of color, right? What does it mean when we adopt a methodology for our scholarship and pedagogy and communal work where we are committed to making room for someone who hadn't even known that there was a meeting being held, right? What does it mean when we don't just make room by writing about their stories, but we bring them to the table with us, like physically they're there in the room with us? And how does that upset the balance of the politics at the table? And then how can we, I learned a few years ago that a good ally is not somebody who stands alongside of you when something bad is happening. It's someone who stands up and makes sure it doesn't get you so you can do what you came to do. And so how can we bring people, right, who have been silenced, made invisible, devalued, into spaces where decisions are being made that impact their lives? And how can we block, step out of the way so that they can have their say and be taken seriously? These are the things, right? And so people like to say all kinds of things about womanist, biblical interpretation, they're not legitimate and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is we're not really here for the people that are making those critiques. We don't really care. We notice and we do what we have to do to navigate those spaces, but there's something bigger and more important at risk and at stake. And that's how we're orienting our use of agency around making space for other people who didn't even know the space existed, hadn't even imagined that there was a possibility for their life experience to be valued. And it's a methodology, right? It's a willingness to be accountable to the communities about whom you write and about whom you do your work.
Thank you. We are doing what our soul must have for the people who need to hear from us, about us, and for us. Thank you. Very, very powerful. I believe Vanessa had wanted to speak to something you said, and then we're going to move into our text for the evening. And so Vanessa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond. Everything that Dr. Compton said is right on. But it's also a learned process, I would add, when you talked about learning to not read against ourselves, because we have been taught to read against ourselves. We've been taught to read from the dominant culture's perspective that often is not for our benefit. One of mine, I know I'm not going to get the title right, but one of the text readings that I find students in a exegesis class is Randall Bailey's The Danger of Interpreting the Bible or reading, the danger of reading the text from someone else's bias. I think it's something like that. In other words, we have not been taught to read it from our own bias, but we've adopted other people's bias that is often detrimental to us. And so an example he gives is when we read Genesis 16 with Hagar and Sarah, and we side with Sarah against Hagar, because that is how we've been trained to read, to side with the master, the mistress. And then he asked the question, so none of y'all know any, your mothers, your aunties, your cousins who were domestics that had to try and navigate that space of not being sexually assaulted or were sexually assaulted by the owner of the house where you work. And in that moment of recognizing, well, yeah, I do know someone who experienced that then they start to read in their own interest than against their own bias. And so sometimes we have to help people to get to the point of reading in their interest and not against their interests, because we've been taught how to read the Bible for so many years. So those traditions that have been handed down to us are not always healthy, and some of them are just downright toxic. Along with excusing God in the text, when God is not on our side. It is not on Tamar's side with when her brother raped her. So sometimes it's hard to just let go and say, that's just, as you said, Dr. Crumpton, that's not healthy to read it as prescriptive. This is just descriptive, and not get that confused. And if it's a text and it's not affirming, it's not liberating, then we need to let it go You know, when we talk about wives staying with abusive husbands because it's in the Bible, let it go.
All right, I do believe we've just gone to school this evening, and so we have this plethora of voices that are teaching us how to lean into not just womanism, but how to read ourselves into the text and to be true to the theology that God taught, that Dolores Williams gives us when we begin to dig into Hagar's story as opposed to Sarah's story. And so that takes us to the text this evening that we want to dig into, because here we are in 2021 and we're still trying to eliminate racism and xenophobia. And so after the death of so many of our sisters and brothers of African descent over the days and the months and the years, what lessons do we learn from Job, Dr. Bridgman, about loss and suffering and being with people with their own agendas?
So I'm gonna take about 6 minutes. I think it'll take me 6 minutes to give you some things, and I'm gonna count on Vanessa and Stephanie and you to pull out whatever lessons you hear here. So we to tell the truth, we chose Job because I've been thinking about Job, and because when we all met, I don't know how much truth telling I'm supposed to tell, but I'm gonna tell it all. So, you know, I'll apologize later if I wasn't supposed to tell it all. We push back, and the we in this sentence is me and Vanessa and Stephanie, push back against the notion that we should somehow address how to end racism. I absolutely think that's white people's work. Melanie Morrison is right about that. I don't feel any need to hold any white person's hand for dealing with anti-Black racism. I have no need to do that. I think they need to put their big britches on, face their uncles, aunties, cousins, whatever. The granddad that went to the Capitol on January 6th, face that and deal with it. That's not my work. And I feel no guilt that I don't see that as my work, right? But when we talk about this UN remembrance of the slavery trade, and this is a decade of Black descendants, African descendants, one of the things that haunts us, I keep using the word haunt because that's the word that I can't quite get away with, is the things that have traumatized us. And because I'm working on Job, I read Job primarily as a trauma text. And some of what Job is trying to get at for his own to survive is to survive the trauma and to survive the bad theology of his friends. Like we often say, his friends were great for 7 days because they sat with him in silence for 7 days. It wasn't until they start talking that you kind of want to go, shut up, just shut up. So a couple of things about that. In a recent episode of Queen Sugar, I don't know if anybody watches that, the very last episode, which is episode 6 in this season 5, they dealt with the George Floyd murder, and it was murder. I don't care what the jury says right now. Hollywood was reflecting on the fact that Hollywood could not get over this grown man calling for his dead mama. And what are we to do with our grief when there's nobody to call on but our ancestors? Like, he didn't say it that way, but that's my way of saying it. He said, I made myself watch the video. I had to bear witness. I had to pay my respects to the brother. Now that's a quote from Hollywood. And so for Job, I think part of our responsibility to this brother from the land of Uz, which We don't even know where that is. So we know that this is more a cautionary tale. It ain't meant to be a quote real life story, but it is a real life story. I mean, Job may not be quote a real person, but as my brother liked to say, one of my brothers like to say, is there is more truth in fiction sometimes than there is in people's telling of their own stories, because you get to tell something that you need to remove yourself a couple of steps to be able to tell the story. I hope that made sense. And if it doesn't, you can ask me about it later. So I chose Job because of this trauma and also because of the theodicy that flows through the book. Theodicy is, for those of you who may not know the term, is where's God when it hurts? You know, how do we account for God when people are losing their lives? If God is all powerful, if God is good, how do we account for God? So this is what is haunting me about the book of Job. How do you turn your face from the white gaze and focus on a couple of things that are true about Job? So the first thing about Job that almost everybody knows about is the bet. Hasatan, which is not the devil the way we have come to know what Satan means, the way it gets interpreted in the New Testament. Hasatan is an adversary, more like a consigliere, an accuser whose job it is to find people, to walk to and fro on the earth and find people who might not be doing what they're supposed to be doing, and therefore to accuse God of holding up unrighteous people. So, you know, Job is supposed to be a righteous man, and so then the bet goes down. So that's what's behind the story. And I think when I talk to Black people, church-going folk, one of the things that I hear more than anything is there's a reason for everything. And what do you do when you can't find the reason for everything? And the thing is raunchy, is horrible, is horrific, you know? And so we're supposed to read Job with, well, there's a reason for everything underneath that. But Job doesn't know that. So when you get to chapter 3 in Job, Job is deeply distressed and depressed. He rails against the day he was born. He doesn't understand why God, if God was going to let this happen to him, why God didn't just strike him dead in his mother's womb? Why did somebody didn't curse the day he was born and bless the day that he dies? So he's not suicidal, though we may think of these as suicidal ideations. He actually is depressed in a way that he cannot see a way forward for life. And I think one of the things about Black resilience that always amazes me is that in the midst of trauma, we still figure out a way through. Depressed, maybe. Not everybody. So I want to honor the people who don't make it through. I don't want to act like Black don't crack, because it does. It does. People suffer. And Job 3 delineates that suffering so clearly to me. And I think that if we're going to take seriously human existence, you have to hear Job talk about him wanting to be out of his pain. How do I get out of this pain? And then the next scripture in Job that I would point you to is one that I heard growing up all the time in church. And it didn't matter what church I was in, whether it was a Baptist church, a Pentecostal church, a holiness church. If it was Black folk, I heard somebody say this from Job 13:15. And I'm going to read it from the King James Version, because this is the way people said it. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. So, but you don't hear the rest of that verse, which is, and I will maintain my own ways before him. So what you don't know about Job, if you haven't been reading the through line up to the 15th chapter, Job has been railing against God the whole time. And his friends have been trying to get him to theologize in a different way. But Job teaches us that if God ain't big enough to take this, if God can't take my smoke, what kind of God is that? You know, if God can't get the smoke, what kind of God is that? So what's interesting about that text is in the NRSV, it says, see, he will kill me. I have no hope, but I will defend my ways to his face. They take the notion of trusting God out, but the note underneath in every biblical text is, I will trust him. So who translated this, I will have no hope? I really want to know the answer to that question. And I went to look in it in the Hebrew, and it actually is, I will trust. So I'm curious about the theological decision that was made with that translation. So in this case, the KJV actually is closer to the biblical, the Hebrew text than is the NRSV. And then the other text I heard a lot growing up from Job is in Job 23, 9 through 11, where Job says, I looked for God and I could not find God. I went to the right and I could not perceive God. I went to the left and behind and I could not find God. And then says, but he knows the way I take. God knows the way I take. This notion that the way it comes up in singing in African-American traditions is we'll understand it better by and by, right? He knows the way I take. And my feet have held fast to God's steps, and I have kept God's way and have not turned aside, even though God is silent. Even though God is silent. So one of the resilience of Black faith tradition for me is the way that Black people keep going forward in faith, even when the heavens are brass and when God is silent. The presumption that God knows the way I take, and eventually God is going to answer. So if you know the story of Job, you know that God does finally answer, starts answering in chapter 38 and goes and answers through chapter 41. And I'm just going to go on and say for everybody, it's not a savory answer from my perspective as a biblical scholar. Like, it's an answer, because for real, I wasn't here when Leviathan roamed the seas, and I wasn't here when creation came into being, you know, because God says to Job, gird yourself up. You step to me like a man, gird yourself up and answer my questions. You're trying to get me to answer questions, answer my questions. Where were you when I created the earth? You know, whatever, which never answers Job's questions, which for me is problematic. I'm just going to go on and say that out loud, right? It's like, and so Job says in chapter 41, I cover my mouth with my hand. Clearly, there are things too deep for me to know. And I'm reading that as sarcasm because I'm like, really, God, that's your answer? I was like, okay. And then the last thing I would say is, and I really want you to hear this, the last chapter of Job, people like to go to it and say, Job got everything back. Job can't get back them kids that died. He can have some more children, but he can't get back the ones that are lost. He can't get back the days that he lost when he was covered with sores. Yes, he got his health back. He can't get back. I mean, there are a whole lot of things you can't get back. You can celebrate that God somehow restored, but you can't act like he got his children back. He had more children, but them children were dead, as were the servants that were dead. But what's interesting to me about, and then I'm done, what's interesting to me about chapter 42 is after all of that grandstanding God does, 38 through 41, God comes to 42 and turns God's anger not against Job, but against Job's three friends who had been defending God the whole time, and says to them, I'm angry with you because you have not spoken right about me like Job did. Everything Job said about God was true. So I like to say to people, now go read what Job said about God. It ain't pretty. What do you do with your grief and your anxiety and your trauma if you can't tell the truth about what you are about the God you are experiencing in the moment, which is what Job did? And God said in the text, Job was right. That's it. Do with that what you will.
Dr. Bridgman, you pushed back, but that was the lesson. And the question was, is it possible to end racism? In my spirit, in my soul, not in my lifetime, not in our lifetime. And so I'm not looking for the end of racism. I'm looking for the liberation. We are looking for the liberation of our people. And we don't always get justice. And when you broke open that Habakkuk text for the folks that were going through Sacred Conversations, and they worked it the way that you had laid it out. And so we don't always get the answer, and we don't always see the righteous get what they deserve in terms of God's grace. Problematic, thank you, indeed. And so Dr. Crumpton and Dr. Lovelace, Dr. Bridgman has given us a text that worked every nerve in my body, every last one. And what is your response? What is your takeaway? And I want those who are participating to be able to begin to think about how you see and live into the text differently. Because part of this is, when I do this work, people want to be right, they want a small God, and they want to feel good about the theology that corrupts those who are being harmed and hurt.
I feel like Jeopardy when I had to get to the button first before I, because I just can't come after Dr. Crumpton. Again, her area of discipline and expertise, she just does it totally. It brings another layer to it than as talking at it from a biblical scholar's perspective. But Dr. Bridgman, first, you did that thing. Let me just say that. One of the things I would add is that I think Job is a helpful story when we look at different stories in the Hebrew Bible. It's polyvocal. There are multiple voices, multiple perspectives. It lets us hear both, the naysayers of Job's friends, like you said, when that lesson that sometimes the best thing is not to say anything. Because we know people will say, well, God wanted another angel in heaven, or God wanted another flower in God's garden. So there's the awful theology that people offer in times of grief, when it's like, it's just best that you just not say anything and just say, can I just sit with you in your grief? And that's all, because I don't have the words. I don't understand what it's like to lose all my children, to lose my whole fortune, and to experience this disease body that I'm going through. And so sometimes it's just best not to say anything. But again, so we get to hear those different voices that we know people in today would say. Well, of course, you must have done something. God doesn't punish people for, this is a God who's a God of justice, and those punishes evil with evildoers with evil, and blesses those who are faithful with good things. And so we get to hear these different voices, which I think is helpful in that text. I think the other area where when we talked about this, that I said I wanted to come in, is the idea of suffering, especially when we talk about Black women, Black Christian women, and the cross, as that it's salvific. When we talk about a text about suffering, and how Black women who have been taught that suffering is a good thing, how do we help to undo that, for Black women's survival and thriving, to reverse that notion that that suffering for the sake of the cross is salvific. And so I talked about, when we were meeting, it just happened that a couple of weeks before that, I was listening to a rebroadcast of Krista Tippett's On Being, and they were interviewing Parker Palmer, the Quaker activist scholar. And so he started by saying, talking about depression and anxiety suffering in the Christian tradition, and especially for the sake of the cross is something good. He said, but I think that there are false forms of suffering that get imposed upon us, sometimes from without, from injustice and external cruelty, and sometimes from within, that really need to be resisted. I do not believe that God who gave me life wants me to live a living death. I believe that the God who gave me life wants me to live life fully and well. Now, is that going to take me to places where I suffer because I'm standing for something, or I'm committed to something, or I'm passionate about something that gets resisted and rejected by the society? Absolutely. But anyone who's ever suffered that way knows that it's a life-giving way to suffer, that if it's your truth, you can't not do it, and that knowledge carries you through. But there's another kind of suffering that is simply and purely death. It's death in life, and that is a darkness to be worked through to find the life on the other side. And so I think one of the things that that notion of resisting suffering for suffering's sake, and saying that it is not good, and it's just another form of death. And I would add to that, of course, now bringing that womanist perspective, we could not go to Dr. Dolores Williams in Sisters in the Wilderness, Womanist God Talk, who again deals with that theme of suffering and Black women as something good and salvific and to be rejected. And so the idea of rejecting the atonement theology, or theology of the cross, that this is something, for those of you who aren't familiar with the atonement theology, that Christ's suffering on the cross for humanity was a good thing. And so likewise, as a surrogate for our sins, that Black women have been put in surrogate positions too often and suffer. And so that rejection of that. And so I'm missing a note to, just talk about, she says, not only is it a sin, or how she defines sin as that which does not bring life to Black women, that whatever dehumanizes Black women, is not life affirming for Black women. For her, that was one definition of sin. And so she says, sin is that which devalues Black women's humanity and defiles their bodies. I must add that. And she says that when we talk about Black women and coerced surrogacy, therefore, fitting and proper for Black women to ask whether the image of a surrogate God has salvific power for Black women, or whether this image supports it and reinforces the exploitation that has accompanied their experience with surrogacy. Can there be a salvific power for Black women in Christian images of oppression meant to teach something about redemption. And so how do we get Black church women especially to recognize that suffering just for the sake of suffering, it does not make us closer to God. It does not make us more holy. And in fact, it does more harm. And then the other person, and then I'll stop, is Shaniqua Walker Barnes' work. That other side of that is, what she would, and what we would be familiar with, is the strong Black woman. The strong, resilient sister. And again, when we talk about, she's a theologian and a clinical psychologist, that Christian tradition, I'm quoting her, Christian tradition has been deeply intertwined with the development of the stereotype, as the Black women's clubs often were located in churches. It continues today in the way we measure a Black woman's faith in the church. It's usually related not so much to her relationship with God or even her struggle for justice in the world, but it's about her capacity to withstand suffering without complaint. She's such a strong woman of God because all this horrible stuff happened to her, but look at her. She's still there. She's still standing. She's a strong Black woman. And the title of her book, which really speaks to that, is Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. And so I just open it back to Dr. Bridgman or Dr. Crumpton to respond to the notion of, when we look at this text of Job and suffering, suffering is redemptive, especially for Black church women.
Thank you, Vanessa. I would encourage those who are still with us to begin to put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to those before we depart at 7:30. Stephanie?
So Vanessa, I chuckled when you said you wanted to go for me before, you wanted to speak before I did. I appreciate the compliment and the affirmation, but I should be honest and say, I'm real glad the Bible folk are here. Real glad, so you can see what it said, right? And Dr. Valerie, I just want to appreciate how you broke that down and helped us. I think that what Dr. Vanessa and Dr. Valerie have done have exemplified why the answer to the question you asked us a moment ago, Velda, around why is womanist biblical interpretation important, right? I want to take a step further, and Dr. Valerie, I appreciate you saying you were not satisfied with what God said in that text, right? And I think that one of the important things that womanist work does or contributes to the conversation around racism and struggling and oppression is it affirms, right? It affirms that we have a right to go find the answers. Womanist work will say there are some parts of this Bible that aren't good for us, so we're not doing that, but where is the righteous word? Right? And so that is one of the gifts, is that womanist work affirms the literary imagination and the history making and history documentation of Black women. And in particular, I'm drawn to the work of the sacred imagination of folks like Toni Morrison. Right? And so what womanist work does is very clear that the sacred, there's not a line between the sacred and the secular, that all that is alive is sacred, right? Which means that we don't have to be bound by the answers that don't get us where we need to go with God, right? And I just really, again, appreciate you, Dr. Valerie, for saying, I don't like that. That didn't get me where I need to go, right? And so the sacred imagine, how are Black women speaking for themselves and to communities around what does it mean to struggle with racism, right? And so in Beloved, and this is, I thank God for Black women in religion and theology who will take up Beloved as a sacred text and honor Toni Morrison as someone whose sacred imagination enlivens us and brings us closer to God. And that sacred imagination, right, is what she's documenting in the person or the character of Baby Suggs Holy. And this is a primary text for a lot of womanists. It certainly is for me. But this whole notion that Baby Suggs Holy is this formerly enslaved woman who had her freedom had been purchased by her son. She had made her home on the other side of the Ohio River to catch those who were crossing the river into freedom. And Baby Sucks Holy, of course, this is historical fiction. She is familiar with the tradition, right, of the missionary or the missionary preachers who would come to the slave plantations. But Baby Sucks Holy, once she gets on the other side of the river and she has her own home, she becomes the preacher for the community. And what I appreciate, again, Dr. Valerie, about what you said is that doesn't cut it for you. And so Womanist work says, where can we find the word that helps us get in God's face even further? And not just get in God's face, get in God's face, get in God's presence, be in community with our whole selves, including bodies, right? And so I'm going to pull just a really quick piece from Baby Sucks Holy about what she does in The Clearing. It's called The Clearing, right? She says, you got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here, flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and to dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me, they do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it and hold it up. And all your inside parts, they just as soon slop for hogs. You got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it, and the beat and beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that you have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize. And so what Toni Morrison does in this piece, as we think about grief and we think about mourning, first of all, she names what is hurting us, right? And so Job, it's the loss of family, loss of life, loss of health. But this is particular. This is Black folks being lynched that she is naming, right? And we need to be able to say the words. And this is what I appreciate about Job, right? Job was like, it's bad. I don't want to hear what none of y'all are talking about. It's bad. And there are some truths, right? There's some healing that can only get better when you tell the whole funky truth, right? When you dare to get in God's face about what's going on, right? And so I appreciate that about Job. But we need some words that name lynching. We need words that name that there needs to be a hand on a back that's about to give out because the grief is too much, right? And this is what Toni Morrison does. And I do think that this is sacred text, right? And so I think that it's not just, so Womanist work raises the question, what is sacred text? And how do we navigate more than one sacred text, right? Which I know for some can be a challenge, but I'm gonna put it out there for us to engage, right? That there are some places where we have to go looking for God in a way that speaks more clearly into our particularity, right? Just like we already talked about how sometimes we need to read the Bible descriptively, because it's not getting us all where we need to go. Can God not be also speaking through the sacred imagination of a writer who honors the people's story and how God shows up through women for the benefit of the entire community, right? And so I love Job because there's truth telling. I also want to offer that we don't have to be trapped in that and the Bible as the only sacred text that can direct us to relationship and connection with God. And that's one of the gifts of liberation theologies that says that God, if we believe in the incarnation, if we believe in the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of God coming into humanity, is it not possible that then God may make God's self manifest through any writing? Now, I know that raises a whole lot, but I do want to offer that there's more than one sacred text for people, and especially there's more than one sacred text when we are particularly looking to recover and end racism. We need a text that's talking about racism, not that we can use to address, but one that's explicitly naming racism, right? And all of its contours, all of its horrors, and also all of the ways in which we have effectively resisted. Because the fact that Toni Morrison writes about this old woman who pulls the people out into the community to heal, that is resistance that empowers us to then continue to fight against and eliminate racism.
Thank you, Dr. Stephanie. There is a question in the chat, but we are really running close to our end time, and I want to respect the time that you all have given us, but the question was around wrestling. And so for Dr. Bridgman, the question was, so what do we do when God's response isn't helpful or doesn't answer the question in light of the continued racism in our society? I'm wrestling with that.
I think Dr. Stephanie just answered. You start listening for the many vocal, the multivocal God, and listen for God's voice in someplace else. The psalmist says the sound of the voice of God is like the sound of many waters, which I interpret to mean that God sounds from many different places and in many different ways. And if the place that you're looking, you can't find God, look somewhere else. I mean, literally. Read Toni Morrison, to quote Dr. Stephanie Crumpton. But my point is, I remember when I was suicidal in my early 20s, and poetry saved my life. I was an ordained minister, reading the Bible every day, but the thing that saved my life was poetry. Reading it and writing it. And that was the word of God to me. So, listen for the voice of God in other places if you don't hear it in the place that you think you ought to hear it.
Dr. Lovelace, Dr. Crumpton, and Dr. Bridgman, you have broken open our souls and our spirits this evening, and I am grateful for you. And so we will begin to look for God's voice, and we have always looked for God's voice through our music, through our art, through our poetry, through our literature, and through each other. That we cannot leave our bodies and our spirits out of that. We look for God in each other. When we look into each other's eyes, when we embrace each other, when we share our stories, when we laugh, when we dance, when we eat, we are sharing the gift of God. And tonight you have shared the gift of God. So I thank you and I bless you. And you will come back. And we won't wrestle. We will find sacred space to do this again. So thank you so much. Before we depart, we have some music that we'd like to share, and then we will send each other off.
I'm listening. I am listening. Speak.
It looks like our music got stuck. So that is fine because we have reached that hour. We want to thank you for being with us on behalf of the United Church of Christ, the Racial Justice Ministries, and Wider Church and Global Ministries. So thank you again. Please come back when we have our Tuesday, Thursday offering, as well as special webinars.